Hey everybody, it's Mike Schumann of the Daily Hoosier for the East 17th Street podcast, joined by Seth Tao and Owen Graham once again. And guys, the question right now is, did we underestimate IU football? All three of us are on the record with 7-5 predictions. And after a 5-0 start, it would take a 2-5 finish for any of us to be right. And sitting here right now, that doesn't feel like the likely outcome. Certainly still within the realm of what's possible. But with a game at Northwestern coming up where Indiana's a double-digit favorite, game at Purdue to finish the season, it feels like two highly possible outcomes right there, right off the bat. And then you got some other games that look probably, I would say, more winnable than they did to open the season when you take into consideration how IU looks and how these other teams look. So I guess I'll turn that introductory question to you, Seth. Did we underestimate IU football?
I'd say a soft yes. I mean, I think we were admittedly conservative in saying 7-5 because we felt like there was because I think we all said going in there was a wide range of outcomes for this team. Like there was just so many unknowns going into the season. We didn't fully know what a Kurt Signetti team would look like, at this level until we saw it, in action. We didn't know how all these transfers would really fit in, how all the new pieces would really fit together. We all picked 7-5, saying, there's however many games on the schedule that we see as kind of toss-ups, and a lot of that wasn't really high-level analysis when we picked those back in August. It was just we gave some to IU, we gave some to the other team, and yeah, I think obviously things are looking really good for Indiana right now. I think they're going to end up going better than 7-5 for sure. It's just a question of how good they are, and they look really, really good. I mean, I think that's the most striking thing to me. It's not like they're winning all of these games and being really lucky in doing
Right.
so. It's not like they've had a bunch of good bounces. This just looks like a really good football team. And yes, they haven't been tested the way they're going to need to be, like come November. Even, Maryland was kind of the first test that they had, just kind of against a program that's kind of been on equal footing with Indiana, more or less, over the last decade. And obviously Indiana passed that test easily. They're not really going to face Nebraska is going to be the best team they're going to have played so far when they get them after the bye. But I mean, it's not like Indiana's been lucky to get to this point. You watch this team, and there's not really glaring flaws, that you can really identify. There's some minor things, I'm sure, that maybe the better teams like Nebraska, Michigan, Ohio State, like whoever, teams like that maybe could exploit like some of these smaller things. But it's not like there's a lot of glaring weaknesses around this team. Indiana's just looking like a really good football team.
Yeah, that's something really interesting, and I want to get into that later when we talk about Maryland, about just no glaring weaknesses. I made that exact note here. But before just kind of staying with the big picture and what we thought going in, Owen, I mean, I one of the reasons I had some reservations about this team was because it's not like they hired an assistant coach from Alabama and he brought 15 players from Alabama with him. They brought a bunch of group of 5 players, and I think one of the questions I kept hearing at the beginning of the season or before the season was, can these guys translate at this level? And I thought it was a legitimate question. I actually asked Signetti that question at Big Ten Media Day because I wanted to see what he thought about it. It's not always an obvious answer, and I think he acknowledged to some extent that there's it's not like it's science. And so to see them play at the level they're playing at right now, I completely agree with Seth that, it's not like it's a lucky 5-0. It's a convincing 5-0, which is the whole reason to have this podcast, really, is like if you remember a couple of years ago, Indiana started 3-0. I think there was a very close win over Western Kentucky and some other game. I think they did beat Illinois to open the season, but there was nothing about that was convincing. It was just like, okay, they're getting by, but the wheels are going to come off this thing at some point. But what, as you recall how you were thinking about it going into the season, Owen, what was kind of giving you pause where, I saw other people predicting like 9-3 and I was like, man, they're braver than I am. What was giving you pause before the season?
Yeah, it's kind of the exact same thing you mentioned. Just all of the group of five kind of talent that you were bringing over. You didn't really know how that was going to translate into, these I guess, higher level teams with UCLA and Maryland. But it's not even that. It's also, you're throwing all of those, some group of five guys into the mix that don't know that JMU system that is being brought over. People like Curtis Rourke had to learn that system overnight, not necessarily overnight, but throughout camp. Miles Cross, who has been a big contributor so far, had to learn that newly. Miles Price, Keyshawn Williams, among all those guys. So those guys had to learn that system completely new. And I think that was the big reservation that I had, along with the talent discrepancy. But I'll go ahead and kind of agree with Seth here. I just to bring up that first question, yeah, I think there's definitely a soft underestimation from my standpoint on or how good this team can be. Like we said, the next few games is definitely winnable. And I mean, next week they're potentially clinching a bowl game, and that's probably something I'm not too sure about. But you'll have to look up historically if they've ever done that in the first 6 games. But it is a very interesting time to be an IU football fan and to follow the team for sure.
Yeah, Seth, one of the things that, if you want to try to poke holes in the start, you could maybe say, and I'm just kind of spitballing here, I'm not sure I really agree with this, but Signetti did bring over all those JMU guys, and they were kind of handpicked JMU guys, guys that he knew would play the way he wanted to play. Were already proven veterans. He's not always going to have the luxury of that continuity every year, but at the same time, next year he will have the continuity from this year. So I don't know if it's necessarily saying he can't repeat it in the future, but he probably did get a nice little assist from so much continuity from JMU last year.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, to that point, maybe an even bigger factor that you kind of sidestep is the staff. It's
Mm-hmm.
not just
Yep.
he brought over almost his entire staff from JMU, and we talked about it in preseason. Kurt Signetti is kind of this CEO type of head coach. Like, he monitors his coaching staff a lot, maybe more so than the individual players on a day-to-day basis. And he kind of lets the the coordinators and the assistants do their thing and really run the show from a player development and not fully strategic. Obviously, Signetti is in on a lot of the strategic and game plans and things like that, and meetings and all of that. But from a development standpoint, he kind of lets the position coaches do their thing for the most part. And when if there's concerns about longevity, forget losing specific players. With the way they're playing, you're going to have to worry about potentially losing staff members,
Right.
because there are going to be guys. I would be very surprised with the way that Indiana's looked so far if you're not seeing. That doesn't mean they're going to leave, but the coordinators could get some offers for head coach jobs. Certainly, you look at the amount of hype around Tino Sunseri, the quarterbacks coach.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he could be in head coach mixes or be in offensive coordinator mixes or things like that. And we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves there. It's still October 1st, and obviously Indiana fans should enjoy this season. You still got 7 games plus likely at this point bowl game to ride this all out with. So it's not something you really have to worry about. But if you're going to talk about the longevity, beyond this year, yeah, you're not only looking at new players, and losing some of the JMU guys, but the staff as well. But on the players, some of the guys that he brought over from it's not like he brought over all redshirt seniors, 5th-year guys with 1-year eligibility. Like, there are some younger guys he brought over from JMU, and some recruits, like commits, that he had planned to take to JMU that then followed him to Indiana. So it's not like this is all, 5th-year seniors that he brought over from JMU. Like, he's still going to have his guys.
Right. Yeah, it's a great point about the coaches. I keep seeing that comment on social media and in the comments section of the site about, yeah, you better enjoy Signetti because he's not going to last. He's going to be there 1 year and he's going to get plucked up. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, he is 63 years old, I think. He obviously could, but I don't know. I got the vibe when he was hired that he wasn't looking to keep doing this over and over and over, and he just wanted a chance to really prove his mettle at the Power Four level. And if you can prove it at Indiana, you've pretty much proved everything that you could possibly prove. But I do think it's a great point about the coordinators. Both because they have a long track record of success at multiple stops. Shanahan and Haynes have been doing this under Signetti for a long time. I think they're both, give or take, late 30s, early 40s. So right in that prime of, when they would, make the move to become a head coach. And, Signetti hasn't been tested in that way in a while anyway, in terms of, having to replace those guys. They've got a lot of comfort in the way they're operating right now. And you even I've in the back of my mind, I've always thought, well, if they lose Shanahan, he'll just promote Sinceri. But you make a good point. I'm not so sure that Sinceri's not going to be like the most attractive OC candidate out there. I mean, all of this is speculating that what we're seeing right now continues throughout the rest of the season, and it is like a 9-3 type season. But there's no doubt in my mind that at the very least they are all high on radars throughout the country right now. I do want to talk a little bit about the Maryland game because I thought that it really illustrated where Indiana's at, probably better than any other game that we've seen to this point. I guess for either one of you guys, can you think of a game where a team was -4 on turnover margin and just looked so clearly dominant in the game, irrespective of that?
Nothing comes to mind here.
No, no.
And I would even add like the play where Maryland got the 75-yard run where Pons runs into the umpire. Like that almost was kind of like a turnover too, because it was such just a dramatic splash play in the game. It came right after an IU touchdown, tied the game with 7 minutes to go in the third. And you just feel like, man, I've seen so many Indiana football teams just melt in moments like that you're just waiting for the thing that breaks their spirit. And they responded with a 21-0 run and just completely dominated the rest of the game. So like we talked about this, Owen, through the first 4 games, like they're gonna face adversity. They're going to encounter moments. It's not going to be this easy, and the response to that adversity is really what stood out against Maryland.
Yeah, and it's actually funny you bring that up. We were going to do a podcast episode after the UCLA game, and I was going to mention this, but we didn't get the chance to. But someone next to me in the press box, I think it was after the D'Angelo Pons roughing the passer call, and they turned to me and said, if Tom Allen was coaching this team would lose the game. UCLA went how it went, and Indiana won the game. So, I mean, it's huge. I mean, and Curt Cignetti said it himself. He did research past Indiana's games, a few like 1-score, 2-score games in the late minutes that you could have back, and that can switch around your entire record. So, the adversity response, especially singling out players, Curtis Rourke, I mean, having those 2 early picks and then really having a nice game and settling back into apart from the fumble later in the game, just settling back into that role and leading the offense, which turned out to be a really big offensive production, 42 points, even with 4 turnovers. So it was really impressive to see that. And it kind of makes you look at it like, dang, if that was Tom Allen's team and that was still kind of his ordeal, it would have gone so much differently. So I think having the attitude to just respond in adversity has been shown clear throughout the team, and you definitely saw it on Saturday.
And just to continue the Allen analogy, like I think when that play happened on Saturday with Pons, I actually thought of the Micah McFadden play against Cincinnati in 2021. Yeah. That was just kind of a freakish play, but it absolutely clearly changed the game, changed the trajectory of a season, changed everything. And I thought like, oh man, here's another crazy, just unlucky play that's going to completely change this game. But it certainly did not go down that way at all. I saw where IU posted like the last time they had won a game with 4 turnovers was in 2016. They beat Purdue. And in 2016, IU was like way better than Purdue. They went to a bowl that year, and Purdue was like 3-9. But they still only won the game like in the last minute, 26-24, because they had so many turnovers. I mean, you just don't see a team just control a game. I do have a question for either one of you about the defensive response to the turnovers, because I keep going back and forth on this. Like, I feel like we've been talking about the fact that IU forced 4 3-and-outs, and I think maybe even a total of negative yards after those turnovers. So Maryland didn't even get a first down. But is that coaching, or is that just back to Seth, your original point that Indiana doesn't have a lot of weaknesses on this team, and they've got a defense that can respond?
I would say, I mean, coaching always deserves at least a little bit of the credit, but I mean, it's not necessarily like, offense turns the ball over suddenly, it's a different situation for it's no different than, say, James Evans shanks a punt and then the defense has to take over in kind of not great field position. It's just Mikhail Kamara talked about it a little bit after the game, and he was kind of, about all the adversity they overcame and the times they had to step in. And, he even said, like, bad teams, those are moments where they would kind of start to argue and just start to lose the plot a little bit. And this team isn't really like that. They just locked in and got the job done. And I mean, that he's right. That's the difference between good teams and bad teams. Nobody's perfect, and you're going to have moments to overcome like that. The defense just kind of locked in, but I don't know if I'd say it's scheme or coaching. I don't think you're calling defensive plays any differently. Certainly if there was a turnover that sent Maryland right into the red zone, then you're maybe calling, the plays a little bit differently. But I think it is just Indiana is a good football team without a ton of weaknesses. Their defense is pretty good, and the culture is such that the players kind of feel the onus to pick up their guys, their other guys when they make mistakes. And surely there were moments that the offense had to pick up the defense in that sense too. But I think it's just kind of a combination.
Yeah, and it is interesting to note, just as a footnote, that all, or at least the first 3 of Indiana's turnovers were in Maryland territory. So if you're going to, caveat the way it turned out in any way, it's far better to commit those mistakes there. I mean, especially the first Rourke interception was in effect a punt. So, they had that going for them, but nevertheless, there was plenty of reasons to get down on themselves. And, especially, when the game got tied at 21 all in the third. But I do want to, highlight the point about having no weaknesses on the team, because I feel like at this point, 5 games into a season, you can point to something on a mediocre football team that, is a way to expose them. They can't pass the ball, they can't run the ball, they can't stop the run, they can't stop the pass. There's usually one of those 4 that a middle of the road Big Ten team, has that weakness. I think they're stronger offensively than defensively right now. I'm more impressed on the offensive side, but there's none of those 4 core areas, Owen, that I point to and I say, you know what, I think eventually Indiana's just going to get exposed in this area.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think it's really a complete roster with a lot of veteran guys, like just looking at it, that have played a lot of college football and know the system pretty well. I mean, I don't know. I think there were some moments for the defensive backs. I think Jameer Johnson got caught a few times, especially on that. I think it was like 2nd and 30, and he had that pass interference against Ty Felton. If there was no contact made, I thought from field level that was going to be a touchdown, because Ty Felton had him beat, and he kind of almost had to make contact with him. But I mean, outside of a few of just getting wide receivers winning the routes, I would say the DBs have performed really well. Yeah, I mean, it's really, there's not really, like you said, just a clear cut option to really nitpick. Obviously, um, you can kind of like point to small things here and there, but it's really impressive with how complete this roster has played through the first 5 games, and how, like you said, you can't really point out to one position group that has a glaring issue. But yeah, kind of speaking on the positives, I mean, the offensive line has made really good strides, especially when you're looking from last year to this year. I mean, the run game has looked really good. I mean, Justice Ellison and Tyson Lawton are kind of splitting snaps evenly. Tyson Lawton has 8 more carries, and Ellison has more yards, and just over, you know, it looks like 70 yards. So, I mean, speaking on the positives, I think the offensive line group has really improved over the past season. And yeah, I had some maybe doubts about that group, especially when Kidwell went down
Mhm.
preseason, but they've really shown that they make the roster even more complete.
Yeah, I would agree. The O line has been a pleasant surprise to this point. I think the concerns went all the way into the FIU game when they gave up a lot
Yeah.
of pressures, but since then they've seemed to have cleaned things up a lot. I mean, Seth, the defense, if they've done anything that you could point to that's concerning, you wrote after a couple weeks about the end of first half drives. I think they've shown that they can give up some splash plays, but so I think they're going to have to score points to win games as the competition gets tougher. But at the same time, that they've also, as a defense, shown that they can make splash plays. I mean, the reason they got off the field after turnovers is because they got sacks. I mean, they're kind of a little bit of a hit or miss defense in that regard. Like, they get a lot of 3-and-outs because they get tackles for loss and sacks, and they do give up some big plays. And probably Maryland was the best offense they faced, and they gave up some points as a result of it. In that regard, it reminds me a little bit of Indiana's defense in 2020 that made a lot of splash plays, got a lot of takeaways. They're not getting as many takeaways this year, but they're getting a lot of tackles for loss and things like that. But I guess to go back to the point I made, and I want to see if you agree or where you might poke holes in it. Just when you talk about the 4 phases, the offense running and passing, defense running and passing, is there one of those aspects that you are like legitimately concerned about?
Not really so far. I mean, to bring some numbers to that, Indiana ranks in the top 25 in the country in all rushing offense, rushing defense, passing defense. They rank in the top 25 in the country in all of those stats. I don't think they're any lower than 23rd in the country. And so that just kind of illustrates how good they've been kind of across the board in all 4 of those phases, so to speak. I don't think there's any. The running game has been really good. The run blocking has been really impressive all season. I think you brought up the FIU game with the pass pro. I do think that Rourke faced a little bit more pressure against Maryland
Mm-hmm.
than he had seen since the FIU game. But to be fair, we were expecting some of that because Maryland's defensive line was the best that Indiana has seen so far this season. So, that was a little bit expected, but that might be one of the kind of smaller concerns that I referenced earlier that, maybe good teams are going to be able to exploit that if they spot weaknesses, in the pass pro. But I mean, Rourke himself has been awesome, and the receiving room has lived up to the hype. The running backs have all looked pretty good, and I mean, defensively, I think the defensive line has improved since the start of the season.
For
I
sure.
mean,
Yeah.
we were seeing, and not that they were bad to start the season, but I think they've looked even better just with both the pass rush and the run defense, and especially when you look at a guy like CJ West, who I wrote about today. That I mean, he was kind of on the short end of the stick rotation wise early on, and he's looked a lot better the last couple games, and kind of more like the guy that Indiana thought they were getting out of the portal. And it's like James Carpenter has already been playing well up the middle. So, you up the middle, they've been really strong. Defensively, I think the only minor concern that I've spotted is I think the linebackers and coverage are a bit of a concern. I think Indiana has gotten beaten a little bit over the middle of the field at times, just, whether it's the slot guys or whether it's tight ends or whoever it may be, like just kind of coming over the middle of the field. Walker and Fisher are both really good players, but I think both of them have that little weakness over in coverage a little bit. Owen, I know you referenced the defensive backs, having a few lapses, and I think those are more just individual mistakes than any grander concern. I mean, that's going to happen to the best of them every now and again, not that often, but I mean, D'Angelo Pons got burned for a touchdown too, and that was really the first time we had ever seen him, I think, get beat like that by Caden Prather. And the penalty on Johnson was one of the bad moments of the game for sure, just given the field position and everything. But I think overall the secondary has held up real well. Now, again, Maryland was the toughest test they've seen so far. Northwestern should not be as difficult for the defense going up against their offense. But I think let's see how they handle the Nebraska game, because I think that will be a real, obviously, we know Indiana's good, but I think that will start to be the measuring stick now for how good.
Just talking about the offense a little bit more, one of the things that's standing out to me, and I think it's one of the reasons why Shanahan and Sunseri will end up being really coveted this offseason is, I think they are really good at in-game adjustments. Like you go back to that UCLA game, it was pretty clear early on that UCLA was trying to bring a lot of pressure in that game, and it seemed like every time they blitzed from wherever they blitzed, Rourke knew exactly where to throw the ball, got it out quick, didn't really give him too much trouble. And then in Maryland, they seemed to want to play a lot of press man, and it seemed to give Rourke a little bit of trouble. They were undercutting some routes early in the game. One of his picks was because of it. I think the pressure bothered him a little bit early. But I noticed you guys were at the game. I was watching on TV, so I don't know if they picked it up where you guys were. But after the second interception, they showed Rourke standing on the sideline talking to Sunseri right before he went back in. And I thought, okay, we're going to find out if Sunseri is the quarterback whisperer, because he was standing there talking to him for a long time, and he went in, and that's when he started playing different. And I think it was partly adjustments. Like if you noticed, like Omar Cooper started winning one-on-ones, late in the second quarter, and Elijah Surratt started making some tough contested catches. It's like they knew exactly what Maryland was trying to do, and because they've got a really good quarterback and good receivers, they were able to go right at it. So I thought that was worth noting. But I do want to go back. I will highlight one thing that I am concerned about with this team over the course of a 12-game season. And Seth, you mentioned this in our preseason talk. I see we have our regular guest is making his appearance. Welcome, Ollie. You talked about depth, Seth, before the season started. And something that really stood out to me from the Maryland game, looking at snap counts, is Indiana did not go deep at all, especially on defense. You think they're going to rotate a bunch of guys, and they really don't. They play almost exclusively at linebacker with Fisher and Walker. The D line really didn't even rotate that much either. If I have a concern, it's that they've been really fortunate from an injury front so far this season. I mean, they're, other than the Kidwell injury, I think anything else they've had to deal with is more just kind of amongst the reserves. If something happens, and it's bound to, it's football, it's going to happen. Are we comfortable that they have the pieces to get through this? I guess, Owen, I'll let you guys both talk about that, because I think it is an important point.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I don't know if I know the answer to that, because you're exactly right. They've been very fortunate. I mean, the most major injury aside from Kidwell that they've dealt with in season was Donovan McCulley getting hurt, and Donovan McCulley wasn't even starting to begin with. And who knows if he would have kind of burst onto the scene by now if he hadn't gotten hurt. But it hasn't mattered, because the other wide receivers have been so good. So you're right that they've been very fortunate in that sense, and they'll be better covered for that in some areas than others. If they were to lose another wide receiver, I think they would probably still be fine. If one of the other running backs went down, I think they would probably be fine. But yeah, at linebacker, if you lose, you're right. They weren't rotating very much, against Maryland. Maybe that changes based on the opponent or the weather or, whatever it may, the moon phase that day. Maybe that changes based on some random factor or non-random factor strategically. But if they were to lose Aiden Fisher or Jalen Walker, how much do they really trust Isaiah Jones to play extended snaps? I mean, the defensive line has rotated enough. I think obviously they rotated a little bit less against Maryland. I still think they probably the defensive line depth looked better than I think we all thought going into the season. Some of those reserves have played well and picked it up. I think they're fine at defensive line depth wise. Linebacker, I don't know. Defensive back, I think they have depth, but I don't know because I think you saw Jamari Sharp come in for that first half when D'Angelo Pons was unavailable against Charlotte, and Jamari Sharp looks a lot like maybe a slightly improved version of what we saw out of him last year. And I think with Jamari Sharp, it's often you trade positive plays and negative plays, and so if they were to seriously lose one of their starting cornerbacks, yeah, I think that could be a problem.
Yeah, and Owen, I feel like throughout IU football's history, they've had a lot of teams where like the starters were competitive with high end program starters, but it's always the depth piece that gets you, that shows up on special teams, and it shows up when you get a wave of injuries. So I don't think in either case we've necessarily seen any issues yet. But what are your thoughts? Is there a particular position group that you think they're particularly vulnerable if something were to happen?
Yeah, I think I kind of going off of Seth. I think linebacker is one that it would definitely be dangerous, even if something happened to Fisher or Walker. I know you wrote about this. A few linebackers actually have just transferred out of Indiana football's program to preserve their redshirt season, and so I think your depth pieces now kind of look like Isaiah Jones, as you mentioned, and then I believe Najee Logan. It was in there. A few snaps here and there in the first few games, and then the walk-on Jeff Utzinger, who usually is on the special teams front. So, they trust Aiden Fisher to make a lot of those plays on defense, especially in the run game. He leads the team in tackles, and he can even show that he pressures the quarterback pretty well. So if either him or even Jalen Walker, who's a really good athlete, would go down, you're kind of going with Isaiah Jones, but then, who's after that? So I think that would be the position group that I would feel most vulnerable. But I mean, as Seth mentioned, it's just kind of play it out until it happens, and then we'll see it go from there.
I think this depth conversation, we talk about, how good is Indiana? How far can they go? How, are we looking at an 8-win team, a 9-win team, whatever? I think the health and depth that we're talking about now, that might be the difference between Indiana having a 9-10 win season, 11 win season, whatever it might be, versus, kind of starting to fade a little bit, going 7-5, 8-4, or something like that. I think this depth, the more I think about it, I think the depth concerns and health of the starters are going to dictate that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And for people that don't know what we're talking about, there's two linebackers that were on the opening season roster, Josh Rudolph and Najee Logan, who have both entered the transfer portal, along with the defensive back, Tyreek McDaniel. As Owen alluded to, it's becoming a trend in college football as guys look to preserve their redshirt season. So these guys have, at least in a couple of these cases, have played in 4 games. And, as people know, you can play in 4 games and still take a redshirt season. So that would be the reason for doing that. I do think it's interesting. I was thinking about this earlier, just how Signetti and his staff are maybe different than a lot of coaches. Like I get the feeling that they're not in any way, shape, or form influenced by things like recruiting rankings or, who the perception of what a player is when they come into a program. And I don't think that's any better illustrated than at linebacker. You mentioned Jeff Utzinger, Owen, you got Elijah Hardy, who I would have told you was probably fourth or fifth on the depth chart coming into this season. I think he's a 2 at this point, according to at least what Signetti said a few weeks ago. And it's guys like that who the staff has said, we don't care who you are. If you deserve it, you're going to see the field. And I think that's probably also contributed to guys like Rudolph and Logan transferring midseason.
Yeah.
Another thought I had, and I want to bounce this off you guys, is as it relates to Donovan McCulley. It's been like a recurring topic throughout the season. Obviously, his injury played a factor in his limited snaps to this point, but it was clear in week 1 that he was already going to be limited before the injury. So it's not exclusively that. Here's the thought I had, Seth. You see the receivers that are thriving in the program so far. It's Miles Price, it's Omar Cooper, it's Keshawn Williams. Guys like that who I would say are smaller receivers, shiftier, thrive more in, like you highlighted, the screens on X today, screen passes, things like just shallow crossers, things like that. I think you got to have a pretty sophisticated route tree, and you got to be pretty shifty to thrive in this system. And I think that might be part of what's holding McCulley back. What's your reaction to that?
That might be. It's kind of hard to tell for me. I mean, because during the spring and even fall camp, I mean, we constantly heard Signetti. Signetti was hard on Donovan McCulley, at least anytime he talked about him publicly. And I think for a while it was hard for us to tell, is this a case of tough love? And, he's trying, and it might still be that, tough love, trying to get the best of him, I'm going to be super hard on you and it's going to benefit you in the long run. Or is he actually in the doghouse here? And is he actually kind of getting buried on the depth chart a little bit? And it seems maybe it's a mix, but it's definitely not just, tough love. He's definitely, there's something that, whether it is like you talk about the route running and maybe they see the other guys that they brought in as maybe more dynamic weapons and athletes, but it's not like McCulley isn't dynamic. We saw what he could do last year. We know what he can do at wide receiver. But maybe they see him kind of as a little bit less dynamic than some of those other guys. Maybe it's, it could be something like even blocking out wide. It could be, there's a number of different things that it could be, but I mean, like we've also said, the other guys out there have played so well. It doesn't feel like they're missing him,
Yeah, no, they're not having any shortcomings offensively right now. It's fascinating to think about McCulley. He is a senior. I mean, this is it for him, and we all thought that this was going to be his showcase for the NFL draft next year. It's still 7 weeks to go, and he didn't really separate himself last year until around this time or even a little bit later. So it's not too late, but it's hard to see how it's going to play out in a real favorable way for him in terms of his professional aspirations. But nevertheless, like it's clear also that Indiana sees him as a weapon in the red zone. Like that's where you have seen him come in the game the last 2 times. It's a very nice option to have a 6'5" former basketball player who you can just lob it up to. He's going to go get those balls more often than not. They clearly, based on Signetti's comments, brought him in specifically for the play he scored a touchdown on. It's just crazy to me that he's only played 1 snap in that game, and that was it.
Yeah, and some of that might be health related too. If he's still not a fully 100% back from whatever his injury was against FIU, if he's not back to 100% yet, maybe he's not able to take on the snap load that he otherwise might. I don't really know, but yeah, I mean, McCauley is the type of receiver that, maybe when there's less field to work with, maybe that's where he's better suited.
Yeah. So let's look forward here. We got Northwestern on Saturday, 3:30 Eastern on the Big Ten Network. A stadium, a kind of a modular lakefront stadium that apparently seats around 12,000 people. I gotta believe, a not insignificant portion of the 12,000 will be Indiana fans, both because of the momentum in the program and because of the large alumni base in Chicago. They always turn out well for big events at Northwestern. Um, Owen, I think you're going up there. I don't know for sure if you're going up there.
Yeah, we're gonna try to make it work. We're gonna try to make it work.
The plan is for you to be up there. Do you think that only having 12,000 people there for one of IU's road games, do you think that's going to give them an advantage?
Yeah. To put it pretty plainly, yeah. I think. I mean, it kind of goes off of just Northwestern hasn't looked, I guess, more standout for them to draw enough base, I guess, on the campus and as a community to really like sell out the stadium and limit any Indiana tickets. But I think for Indiana, this is going to be not necessarily a neutral site, but just with the low crowd count and, like you said, a lot of alumni base in the Chicago area, and Indiana will most definitely travel well with their fast start. I think I wouldn't put it as close to the UCLA game as an advantage, but I think it's going to be around there. I think Indiana should have no problems, I guess, with the crowd specifically. And it's just going to come down to the fact that if they can get the job done, and Northwestern really hasn't looked like any dangerous threat to them so far this season. I know they're on their second quarterback already, so I think Indiana does have a very good chance to clinch bowl eligibility come Saturday.
I can't really think of like a analogous situation where you could say, okay, if you go into a road environment like this, it's advantageous or disadvantageous because
Right.
it's weird, or I don't know.
Yeah.
The only thing about it, Seth, that stands out to me is it's on the lakefront, which means it's probably going to be windy, which could hamper Indiana's passing game a little bit. Do you have any other thoughts about just the road atmosphere itself?
I'm not sure that it matters for this
Yeah.
Indiana team. I mean, we saw all week leading up to the UCLA game how business-like they were about it. Obviously some of the players were a little excited to go play in the Rose Bowl, and how could you not be? But I mean, they saw that as a business trip, and we heard that for months. And I mean, they came out and sure backed that up against UCLA. So I'm not sure that I'm not sure that it really matters. The impression you get from the coaching staff is that's how they are going to view all road trips, whether it's playing at, a historic stadium like UCLA, or whether it's playing at a temporary lakefront stadium that doesn't hold that many people. I'm not sure that it really matters.
Yeah, and it does seem like that's like what Signetti puts as job one for him, is like all the stuff that we sit here and like to talk about as the media. Like his job is to make sure none of that matters.
The rat poison.
Yeah, there you
Yes.
go. It is very funny that he's not afraid to adopt that phrase, even though everybody knows where it comes from. So Indiana, last I saw, is a 13-point favorite. I think we all picked Indiana to win this game. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but we all thought it would be kind of a weird, kind of low scoring, could go either way type of game. It now feels like a game. It would be very surprising and disappointing if Indiana were to lose it. But here's an interesting fun fact for you. Indiana has not won at Northwestern since 1993. And my measure of whether or not something has been a long time ago is whether or not I was a student at IU at the time, which I was. That was my junior year at Indiana. So that was a very, very long time ago for Indiana to not have won at Northwestern, which is kind of a program on the level with Indiana by and large throughout history. So to not have won there in 31 years is a pretty crazy stat. But there is also a parallel, and I posted this on X. by winning that game in 93, they allowed themselves that win in 93 put them in the rankings and allowed them to play a home game the following weekend at or against Michigan State in Bloomington. That game the following weekend in 93 was the last time that Indiana has played as a ranked team in front of their home crowd. Not counting 2020 because they didn't have any fans in the stands, but taking out the 2020 season, they haven't played at home. So you talk about a fan base that's hungry to have something to cheer for. It has been a long time. And just to think about if they do beat Northwestern on Saturday, what the environment is going to be like for Nebraska. You got so many things going on. You have great fan base at Nebraska coming in. You got homecoming. You got Hoosier hysteria the night before. You probably have 2 ranked teams at that point. I mean, that's going to be one of the biggest IU football games in a long, long time.
Yeah, and
I always forget they weren't ranked for that Cincinnati game.
What's that?
I always forget they weren't ranked for that Cincinnati game.
Yeah, they dropped off right after they lost to Iowa. Everybody immediately lost faith. What were you going to say, Owen?
I've just heard some conversations I think Xander Diamont might make a return to the Nebraska game. Yeah, I want him to pull out the read option with Tyler and AT so bad one last time, but those were some good years. But yeah, like you said, it sets out to be a really good matchup.
I do want to bookmark Xander Diamont for a second because I want to go through the rest of the schedule. And so when we get to Ohio State, I want to come back to his name, but did want to talk a bit about Northwestern because, Indiana's offense is ranked 4th nationally, according to PFF. Northwestern's defense is 38th. So I think that's the key matchup really is, can Northwestern slow Indiana's offense down? Northwestern's offense is 105th and Indiana's defense is 9th. So that kind of feels like a mismatch there. I think Northwestern's coming off a bye week, which I guess is a little bit of a wild card factor, although we saw how much that helped Purdue against Notre Dame. It's not always what you think it is. I guess the question is how much retooling could Northwestern do, especially with their offense over the course of 2 weeks? They started Jack Lausch, if I can pull these numbers up here. They've made a quarterback change already, and Lausch started against Washington, and check out these numbers. He was 8 of 27 for 53 yards with 2 interceptions and was sacked twice. That was after they made the quarterback change. So whether or not he's even I'm pretty sure that's not good. So, where they're at from a quarterback standpoint, I guess, is to be determined. Any thoughts about this game based on how much or how little you guys have paid attention to Northwestern to this point?
I mean, just hearing that, that's obviously probably a concern for Northwestern. I don't know much about Washington's defense per se. I mean, it could be really good, but I will say this. I mean, Jed Fish knows how to cook, not Jed Fish. Their new head coach who came in last year. I mean, he came in and he tuned up a winning program just after a year. So I think, it's nothing to gloss over for this Northwestern team. And, the bye week probably will help them maybe make a little bit more adjustments. Maybe going through Indiana film an extra week could serve some benefit. But I just think, with how Indiana's playing right now and the momentum they have, I don't see a problem with the Hoosiers taking it.
Yeah, David Braun is the Northwestern head coach. And
sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. I just looked it up while you're talking, so I'm not gonna I'm not casting aspersions, but they were the kind of the darlings of the Big Ten last year. I think if I'm remembering correctly, that he won Big Ten Coach of the Year. I think everybody had no expectations after everything that went down with Fitzgerald and all that. So, what about you, Seth? As you think about this matchup, is there anything about Northwestern that you feel like could possibly give Indiana trouble in this game? Did we lose Seth?
I think it was having somebody else.
What's that?
No, wait, can you hang on?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, you can hear me? Sorry, I think my mic it came unplugged and I settings got screwed up. I did hear your question. I do think that Northwestern's offense is going to struggle to keep up with Indiana. Even obviously, like we say, the Indiana offense versus the Northwestern defense is kind of the interesting matchup here. Northwestern's passing offense is not very good. Is kind of middle of the road at best. Their rushing defense is kind of where they've been pretty solid so far this season. And like we talked about, if it's windy, I don't know exactly what the conditions are supposed to look like on Saturday yet, but if it's windy at all and they have trouble throwing the ball, although it was windy here against Maryland, and First Work didn't have that much of an issue with that. And he said after the game the conditions didn't really impact him throwing the ball or gripping the ball or anything like that. So I'm not sure how much of a factor that's going to be, but the Northwestern's run defense could pose a challenge for Indiana's rushing offense, but also, in fairness, the 4 teams that Northwestern has played against so far, 3 of them have what I would describe as bad rushing offenses, based on the stats they've put up so far, and Washington's is the best, and they're 61st in the country in rushing offense. So it's not like Indiana is the best rushing offense that they will have gone against so far this season. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there. Yes, their Northwestern's rushing defense has looked good so far. I think they're 10th in the country so far in rushing defense, but this is going to be by far their toughest challenge in terms of rushing offense. So I guess that's kind of where you're looking at with this matchup, but it doesn't look like a game that Indiana should have any trouble with at this point.
I would agree. It sounds like we're all predicting a 6-0 start here, bowl eligibility 6 games into the season, which is pretty crazy to even be talking about. It would be the second ever 6-0 start, along with the 67 team. I think the 1910 team started 5-0, but then lost in week 6, so they would further distinguish themselves with the 6-0 start. Looking ahead to the remaining schedule, that, like I said, there's a bye week after Northwestern, then that Nebraska game. Here's one thing I want to bounce off of either one of you guys. I kind of bracketed Nebraska, Washington, and Michigan State. Do we think, based on what we know about them and what we know about Maryland, would we say that any of those teams are just significantly better or worse than Maryland is kind of the measuring stick?
I think Nebraska is. I think Nebraska is significantly better than Maryland. I know Nebraska lost the game at home to Illinois, but I also think Illinois is pretty good. So I'm not. That's not really like a bad loss. Like those are 2 good teams going at it. I think Nebraska is a tier above Washington, at least a tier above Washington and Michigan State. That's going to be one of the 3 toughest games of the entire season for Indiana when they play Nebraska.
And I guess Owen, I probably none of us got to watch this because I think it was going at the same time. But how did Nebraska end up in a scoreless tie with Purdue in the first half last weekend?
Beats me. I was on the field and I looked at Twitter. It was actually like an hour. It said like an hour later, and it said the halftime score with Purdue was 0-0. And I was like, wait, no, there's no way. And then I pulled up the score, and Nebraska, it was like 28-3 with 2 minutes left in the fourth quarter. So
yeah,
I agree with Seth though. I think Nebraska clears Maryland probably with a good margin. Michigan State might be the one to say maybe you have a comparison between the 2. But yeah, that's where I would put those 2 teams. And then Washington kind of in that same boat, maybe a little bit less than Michigan State.
And comparing to Maryland, I mean, Michigan State beat Maryland. So, Michigan State could be a tougher game than Maryland.
Good point.
Yeah.
I will pat myself on the back with nothing to back myself up yet. But I did say I'm looking for something to pretend like I was more optimistic at the beginning of the season than I really was. I did say Indiana could compete with Michigan in our preseason podcast. I feel better about that now than I did then. I'm still not sure. I need to see more of Michigan. It feels like they have a really good running game, but still questions their quarterback, and they have a good defense. So I think that's going to mean they're probably going to have a lot of close games. How do you guys feel about Michigan right now in terms of whether or not Indiana can get that game?
I think it's absolutely in play. I was the one on here before the season saying I didn't think that was a game that was going to be in play for Indiana. I thought Michigan was clearly going to take a step back, but was still going to be too tough, too much for Indiana. And I think now, from what we know of Michigan, obviously, beating USC. That was a really good win for Michigan, and I think they held up a lot better against Minnesota than I expected. And the passing game I think the passing game of Michigan is the big concern. I don't think they have much of a passing game so they are, like you said, I think they are going to end up in a lot of close games, and just between that and with the way Indiana's played, I think that game is absolutely in play.
Also, another team that had made a change at quarterback too, and they're starting Alex Orji, who's, we haven't seen much enough for him to really say, hey, this is a guy that's going to give Indiana problems. But the run game is definitely the concern. But to go off Seth, yeah, I agree. It's definitely in play for sure.
And then I mentioned Northwestern and Purdue. I feel like those right now you pencil those in as wins. The other one that's out there that we all agreed, and I think everybody agrees is going to be really tough, is at Ohio State. I did bookmark Xander Diamont because thinking about him, he drove Indiana down to the red zone in like the final drive of a game. I can't remember the year, with a chance to beat Ohio State.
That was my freshman year.
Okay. When was that?
It was 2015.
Okay.
Wow.
The reason why I bookmarked it, because there have been those years against Ohio State where Indiana was clearly outmatched, and it kind of goes to that earlier point. But they do have enough talent at their starting level to compete and hang some years, not always. There's been some obscenely ridiculous blowouts too, especially in the recent vintage years. Do we think that this could be one of those years where Indiana's, in it in the fourth quarter, at least, based on what you've seen from both Indiana and Ohio State?
I've done some thought about it, and
you already don't sound convincing.
Right. It really depends. It's a game that's so late in the season where a bunch of things could happen, like we said, about in depth, and we have no idea what's going to happen with that. But I would say it's possible. It's competitive in the fourth, but Ohio State looks like a very good team, college football playoff national title contender type team. So I will remain on the optimistic side, but not on the radical, we're going 12-0, making the college football playoff. But I think it has a chance to get competitive. I think it'll still be at least a 2-score game in favor of Ohio State.
What about you, Seth?
I still see that game as could Indiana keep it close for a time? Yeah, I think, but competitive in the fourth quarter. I don't know exactly where I draw the line on it, but I mean, Ohio State has done absolutely nothing to take themselves off that pedestal as clearly the best team in the league. I mean, maybe the only thing you can kind of hope for is that they start looking ahead a little bit to the Michigan game the next week. But I mean, if Indiana continues playing this well and comes in with if they're, I mean, that would be week 11. So, if they come in at 10-1 or 9-2 or something, that's going to feel like a bigger game for Ohio State than they originally thought. So,
right.
It's hard to even see them not getting up for a game like that against a really good team. I think Indiana is going to have a good chance in all of their games except for Ohio State. I still think Ohio State is pretty clearly better than Indiana in pretty much every facet of the game.
Okay. Well, I do want to wrap with kind of re-examining, since that's the headline here, our predictions for the season, not necessarily game by game or anything like that, but just like your win ceiling for this team, your realistic win ceiling, like where you think they're going to end up. I can't even believe I'm saying this, and I think this is what limited my expectations at the start of the season. It's just like it's hard to get too crazy when you're talking about IU football, but I think a 10-2 season is a realistic season right now. What do you guys think about that?
I agree. I am also might be even crazier and would maybe throw in 11 wins. I mean,
is that a question?
But you look at the schedule, I mean, there's at least a very, 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 very minute chance.
Yeah.
I think the Ohio State game is obviously the one loss that I'm talking about, but that would be an everything goes right type of case. So,
right. And that's why
realistic, I would say 9 to 10.
Yeah,
but
that's why I'm not saying 11, because everything doesn't always go right, even though it has to this point. I mean, there's just going to be that one game that's stupid and it's nothing goes right. What do you think, Seth?
I tend to agree. I think 10-2 is probably, in my mind, the most realistic outcome at this point, based on what we've seen from Indiana, what we know of the schedule the rest of the way. I think there's a decent chance that, especially, depending on how Michigan and Indiana both look the rest of the season. I mean, think about this. There's a chance, and I guess, depending on how Nebraska looks leading up to that game too, but there's a chance that, could Indiana be favorites in every game except Ohio State the rest of the regular season? I mean, I think that's, a chance. I think 10-2 feels realistic. 11-1 would require them to obviously beat Michigan or Ohio State, and if they drop somewhere else. If you're getting to 11-1, suddenly you're then, putting yourself in position to maybe go to Indy, and that would come down to tiebreakers and all of that.
Right.
And that, again, still feels a little bit out there, not based on anything that Indiana has done to this point, but just kind of, we haven't seen them against the elite competition that it would take. They'd have to be knocking down to get to that point. But I think 10-2 is very realistic at this point, based on the schedule and what we've seen from Indiana.
I will add on to that real quick.
Yeah, go ahead, Owen.
Yeah, I think ESPN and their matchup predictors that they have, I think Indiana's favored in all of them except Ohio State. So take that for whatever what's worth. But yeah,
that's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, FPI has IU winning every game but Ohio State. So that sounds like a good point to leave this podcast on right there. Unless you guys have anything else.
Well, we'll see about Northwestern. Hopefully I'm there. I might be on a boat.
It's not a bad idea.
Yeah.
All right. For Seth Tao and Owen Graham, this is Mike Schumann for East 17th Street. We will catch you all the next time.